Hello. Could all of our speakers turn on their videos and microphones? Not microphones, videos. Okay. Good morning, everyone. If you're in the United States, good afternoon. If you're in Europe, welcome to another GMF webinar on Turkey. This time our theme is Turkey and the West, keeping the flame burning. But this webinar will be a little bit different from the on Turkey webinars that we have been organizing since the beginning of the pandemic. This one is actually part of a program that is based at GMF Brussels office, which is called Turkey, EU and Global Affairs. The program is generously supported by the Union of Chambers and Commodity Exchanges of Turkey. And we have recently learned from TOBB, which is the abbreviation of this organization, that the program will be extended as it is despite the pandemic. So let me thank TOBB for their generous and ongoing support, which makes activities such as this possible also in the future. So as I told you, our discussion today is on Turkey and the West, keeping the flame burning. Of course, it implies that there's a problem, and actually that there is even the vague possibility that the flame could actually die, which is what we are trying to prevent. We have four extremely qualified speakers. We have Galip Dalay, who will be speaking to us from Berlin. We have Kadri Tastan, who is actually the senior fellow of the program that TOBB is supporting, speaking to us from Brussels. We have Ian Lesser speaking to us from Brussels, and Valeria Talbot, last but not the least, Valeria Talbot speaking to us from Rome. Sorry for my mispronunciation, Valeria.
No problem. Just to say that from Milan.
From Milan, which is a much better place anyway. Sorry. Sorry
I don't know in time of pandemics, but
well, I hope everything will be better soon. So we want this actually to be as interactive as possible. So how we'll do this is I will ask a series of questions, short questions with short answers to each speaker, and then get back to you for questions. By the way, if you're using a PC, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you're using a telephone, it may be in a different place, but it still will be a Q&A button. So this is how you can contribute to the discussion. And please do start using the Q&A function as soon as the discussion starts, because my colleague Ceylan will, unless there's another reason, will ask the questions in the order that they are asked. And in case we run out of time, the questions that are asked earlier will get a better chance of being responded to. So we'll start with Galip, and with Galip I will discuss Turkish foreign policy in general. Now, Galip, saying Turkish foreign policy, I mean, is there something that we can actually call a Turkish foreign policy today? If so, what are the main characteristics of this policy? And while answering, please also weigh in on this strategic autonomy, which is a term that's become very fashionable in Turkey. And please try to limit your remarks to 2 minutes or so. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Özgür. I mean, to start with whether Turkey has a foreign policy is quite an ambitious question, and I hope that I will try to answer it. I think, yes, it does have a foreign policy. I mean, a country of Turkey's size will not afford not to have a foreign policy. I think the major question is not whether Turkey has a foreign policy, whether, you know, two things is very important. A, the Turkish foreign policy is in the direction that its society wants to be. Like, you know, this is the foreign policy, not just of that of the government, but that also that of the society. I think this is the most crucial aspect, because in the end, any foreign policy rests certain on the idea of certain domestic politics. So the link between foreign policy and domestic politics is the most important one. If you want to, like, you know, have a close countries, the foreign policy that you will be pursuing is different than if you want to, you know, pursue a foreign policy of a country that wants to, in a sense, go play in the major league when it comes to economic developments, democratic developments, domestic political developments. So this is the first part. But right now, the reason that sometimes the question that's the Turkish foreign policy is very much contested, because for some, the Turkish foreign policy is being seen as quite abnormal, because like it seems like, you know, as if it's breaking away from certain previous trends. But for others, this is actually the new normal. So the question is Turkish foreign policy abnormal, or is Turkish foreign policy the new normal? I think to some extent, I will say, like, you know, the characteristic of both is part of this question. And I think to some extent we will be seeing this is becoming more and more new normality. One thing that Turkish foreign policy is lacking at this stage, it doesn't have an overarching framework, or it doesn't have an overall narrative. And maybe that also has to do what we are living now. I think we have reached, in terms of grand narratives and grand strategies, we have reached these limits. We're not living in a world of grand narratives and grand strategies. But then what do you have? Like, if it's not like, you know, a foreign policy of grand narrative and grand strategy, some extent, I think, like, you know, some of the previous nation security files are very much dominating the agenda. The Turkey is operating more as a regional power and asserting itself as a regional power. So, and there, once again, you see some of the traditional foreign and security policy files, or the nation security files that has been on the agenda of the Republican period, is once again coming back. In Iraq and Syria, you see this once again, the Turkish siege mentality is striking back. Turkey feeling that it's being, in a sense, like, you know, surrounded, so-called, like, with the Kurdish corridor, be it the PYD or PKK, but effectively a Kurdish corridor. And in Eastern Mediterranean, Turkey feels that it is being the subject of a double containment by the, you know, not only particularly by the US, like as well too in recent years. And now, like, recently, there has been the discourse is a bit changing on Libya between Turkey and US. But, like, you know, up until this moment, Turkey was, like, extremely feeling that it's being contained in the Eastern Mediterranean as a result of this emerging energy and security framework that is very much centered on Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and Egypt. And to, in a sense, to counter this, you see, like, you know, Turkey is resorting to a quite hard power policy. And there, when you
may I ask, where's the place of the West in this? And I will,
exactly,
of course, end this question. I mean, maybe we are being a little bit oversimplistic by saying
sure,
the West, because there is actually not one West. So where is the place of the West in this? Where is the place of the rest in this?
sure.
And then the strategic autonomy aspect in 2 minutes.
Well, actually, let me, you know, link them, because, like, you know, Eastern Mediterranean is a good example of this. In the end, the strategic autonomy has been one of the buzzword of the Turkish foreign policy in recent years. But I think by strategic autonomy, Turkey did what effectively, when you operationalize the idea of the strategic autonomy, what effectively Turkey is saying is reducing Turkey's dependency on the West. That doesn't mean, like, you know, basically turning Turkey into an autonomous, strategic autonomous actor in international affairs, which I think is unattainable in today's world. The strategic autonomy for even, like, you know, any major powers is not attainable. But effectively, when you operationalize it, the strategic autonomy means, like, reducing Turkey's dependency on the West. Because, like, when you look at the Syria, for instance, Turkey effectively traded its relation with its dependency from the US to that of the Russia. And here you come, like, the question of the West. I think, like, what you see in relation between Turkey and the West, Turkey is not giving up on the West. So let's be clear this. Turkey is not giving up on the West. But Turkey is giving up on the idea of the Western indispensability. For a long time, for Turkey, the West was a reference point for many foreign and security policy. So it has to, like, you know, filter its all other engagement through the lenses of the West, its relation with the West. So the Western relation was unique and special. But now Turkey believes that, in a sense, the world is not as Western-centric. And sometimes Turkey, many in Ankara sees this as the world being post-Western. And as a result of it, Turkey believes that, many in Ankara believes that now it's a time to engage in a geopolitical balancing act between different centers of power. So in this reading, the West is one center among many other centers. And Turkey believes that by engaging in a geopolitical balancing act, actually your relation, your interest can be, like, better attained. So when you apply this to Syria, I mean, last point, what Turkey sees, the fact that it could engage Russia and the US at the same time is what brought Turkey on the ground in Syria as well too. And I think now to some extent you will see this in Libya. At the same time, you will see a track that will engage with Russia, another track that will engage with US, and a third one that will try to like reach out to the like-minded, the European states, be it the Italy and Germany. So through this kind of like, in a sense, like for Turkey, this is not giving up on the West, but giving up on the indispensability of the West, and creating like kind of like a balance between different centers of power. And this is, I think, one of the major differences between today's Turkish foreign policy and the previous one. Particularly when it comes to Russia and the China, this is the difference. I think that traditionally, the previous Turkish administration would establish good relation with Russia and China, but would be very much cautious or very much careful not to be that much dependent on Russia and China, but particularly Russia. And this is like one of the major difference. And but the question on Russia is this Turkey and Russia, but is this Putin and Erdogan? Because you don't know whether when we talk about this Turkish-Russian relationship, are we talking about like really Turkey-Russia, or are we talking about Putin Erdogan? In my judgment, at this stage, it's
that requires another webinar.
Exactly.
Actually hold. But my last question to you: in your section of the report, you talk about Turkey's status anxiety within the West. Can you open that up a little bit?
I mean, both of the Turkish relation with the current relation with the US and Europe, to some extent, is the product of the Cold War, and there is an hierarchy built in this relationship. Because in the end, both the US relation, basically it was like a relationship of the major international power, the superpower, and a regional power, which back then was for its own security was very much dependent on the NATO and the US as well. And today is also. And with the Europe, it was the accession framework. The accession framework is not like a framework. When you accept the accession framework, this is not a relationship of equality. This is like a hierarchy relationship. Particularly starting with Europe, the accession framework was supposed to, indicate one day Turkey will accede to the Europe. The moment that this is not the case, then the goal, the price that was making you to accept this hierarchy is not there. So when this price is not there, then you question the framework. So in this regard, I think Turkey does not, one of the major trouble, Turkey wants to be treated as a regional power, no longer like, these applicant countries, even though it's still an applicant countries, and with the applicant countries that effectively assumes the hierarchy. I think like at this stage, one of the major demands of Turkey, one of the at least like uneasiness, unhappiness that I see, the Turkey wants to be like more and more treated as a major region power, particularly when it comes with European, and that effectively means like being treated as equal rather than an applicant country. How you can operationalize this, given the fact that Turkey is still an applicant country, theoretically, that's a 1 million question. And the same with the US. How can you establish a different kind of the relationship within the framework of NATO? It's another question. But in the end, what I see one of the major unhappiness in Ankara is what I see the status anxiety vis-a-vis the West.
Thank you very much, Galip. I think this is a perfect moment to turn to Kadri to talk about EU-Turkey relations. So Kadri, my first question to you is actually to characterize EU-Turkey relations today. What the aspects of the relationship? I mean, we talk about Turkey-EU relationships, but we're talking about actually relationships with different characteristics under the umbrella of EU-Turkey relationship. Can you talk to us a little bit about those?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon from Brussels. So first, before answering your question, I would like to thank to my co-authors for this contribution to this policy paper. It was really great to work with you and also sharing this platform with you. Well, to characterize the EU-Turkey relations, I think we should first of all put different pillars, maybe the main pillars of the EU-Turkey relations. And I will put maybe on 3. And the first one, and probably the most important one, of course, it's the accession process, and which is the framework for the normative and rule-based relations that actually is going nowhere. So the European Union, since some years, unfortunately, not even pretending to treat Turkey as a candidate country. Turkey went through the incredible political transformation, maybe even lost to some extent its eligibility to join. I mean, to answer at least the Copenhagen criteria. So actually, the state of the accession process is also reflecting the situation, the worrying situation of the EU-Turkey relations. And the second dimension, second pillar, would be transactional relations, interest-based relations, and especially since 2016, since this migration deal, we can say that actually Turkish EU relationship, they just moved from this accession framework to the transactional framework, and which is the dominant nature of these relations. And as a third pillar, I would put the custom union. Why I'm putting not with the first or the second one? Because I think it's the midway between purely transactional and normative relations. There are still some rules. It depends from which perspective it's seen. If we are looking at the custom union. And unfortunately, custom union also need to be modernized, updated, and there are many technical issues. It became a kind of old-fashioned custom union, this custom union that is in place since 1996, but is blocked for the political reason, and the council doesn't seem to give its green light to opening the discussion. So this is basic picture of the EU-Turkey relation, I would say.
Kadri, in your section, you mention, actually you say very explicitly that the existing framework of EU-Turkey relationship just doesn't work and it needs to be updated. What do you mean when you say it doesn't work? And why do you think it doesn't? What are the reasons it doesn't work?
Well, in principle, the EU has a powerful tool to shape the institution and the political structure in other countries through the accession conditionality, right? But there should be two preconditions for this to be effective. The first, a genuine willingness of the EU to accept the new members, and the secondly, a genuine willingness of potential members, candidates, to accept the body of the EU law. And unfortunately, the first condition only existed in 2004, maybe 2005. And among a limited number of EU countries and European leaders, why no concrete steps have been taken on the second in Turkey for a long time. And despite the end of credibility of accession process, two sides continue to play the game, I mean, for their own reason, I would say, but with the weak and non-credible conditionality, the internal change induced by the EU have stopped, and the EU doesn't have any influence on Turkish political course. Even if the accession process became non-functional, but it continued to affect the relations by inflaming even the political crisis between two parties. So Turkey never swallowed the EU closing the membership door, and this became a matter of pride for it. And Ankara continued to discuss membership and the relations with the EU through the mistreatment it suffered over 10, 15 years ago when the door was closed on its membership prospect. But this ignored the fact that the country, this political situation in recent years has removed its eligibility to also join the EU, as I mentioned before. Meanwhile, the EU continued to cite the political situation in Turkey as a main reason for blocking the accession process and continue to use this process as a tool to make itself part by Turkey or to have some leverage over Turkey. But on the other hand, it's also accepted the end of or the freezing of the normative relation with the refugee agreement. So neither picture is actually complete and both though partially accurate. Therefore, instead of being an opportunity for convergence between Turkey and the EU, accession framework has become a hurdle to any meaningful engagement and cooperation. So more ominous, not only is the prospect of accession is no longer plausible today, even I would say that even a privileged relation seems to achieve due to the current state of relations.
Kadri, I will not ask you to talk about a new framework in 2 minutes. That's impossible. But can you, if Turkey and the EU were to come up with a new framework, what would be some of the most important elements, building blocks of this new framework?
Well, it's a really difficult question, obviously, but in my opinion, this new framework could have two clear features. First, the reward for this new form of relationship, be it custom union modernization, visa travel for Turkish citizens to Europe, or much closer coordination between Turkey and Europe on foreign security policy, but should be attainable for Turkey. Second, this framework should not be solely premised on pragmatic and transactional dimension. It should still have strong value and normative dimension. And this is probably the most difficult part. Therefore, Turkey attaining this reward should be contingent upon its fulfillment of the predetermined normative criteria. And the acceptance of this normative criteria and standards will depend on the economic and other benefits, obviously. So the EU needs to demonstrate the credibility of its commitment to Turkey, meaning it should be serious about delivering the stated reward, of course, if Turkey meets the preset goal and standard. So rejecting the transactionalism in Turkish-EU relation is obviously illogical today, but also reducing to the whole EU-Turkey relations to the transactionalism is illogical. Rejecting is not possible because you have major problem, because the transactionalism became the order of the day when there is a problem, and this is the reality. When you have a refugee crisis, you have to find a solution. But to reduce the whole issue to the transactionalism, there you will miss a big point, because the EU-Turkey relation is effectively a domestic political issue for both sides, not a foreign issue. Europe cannot isolate itself from what is happening internally in Turkey. There are always repercussions in Europe. Think about just the Turkish diaspora in Europe, around 6 million. Anything that happened in Turkey changed their behavior too, have impact on them. And we saw through the different episodes before, from the custom union, the economic cooperation, and to the political fights, they are all intervened. And so therefore is not whether it's transactionalism or not. Can we add the transformation to this transactionalism? That is probably the most difficult part of the equation, but should be done in a way that is, I accept it, but it will be really, really difficult.
So Kadri, this is not a question to you, but a question to all of us. So we see that actually the normative nature of EU-Turkey relations actually weakens the strategic relations between Turkey and the EU, and then the strategic relations due to, let's say, national interests of EU member states sometimes weakens the normative aspect of the relationship. So could there be a synergy between the strategic aspect and the normative aspect of EU-Turkey relations, or by their nature, is it supposed to be a negative synergy? I mean, this is, I'm just putting on the table for discussion later. And with this, let me turn to Ian. Ian, you will talk about maybe a somewhat easier relationship, US-Turkey relationships, but you have been following this relationship for a long time, not only following, actually, working on the relationship, including in your role at the State Department a few decades ago. You have written at least one book that I have read, unless there are books that I did not read, and several articles and essays on US-Turkey relationship. Could you talk to us a little bit about the nature of this relationship that is actually maybe not changing so much?
Özgür, thank you very much, and it's good to be here with all of you and friends. I mean, in a word, I mean, this has always been an extremely difficult relationship to manage for both countries, in fact. It is simply not, we are not, in a sense, natural allies. We're far from each other. Our interests sometimes align, but not always. There are many things that we actually have in common, and we could talk about that. I mean, in some ways, some of the difficulties in US-Turkish relations come from the fact that we are more similar than we sometimes like to admit, in fact. And I think the experience in recent years actually absolutely underscores that, because you see some of the same tendencies in my country, in the United States, that you see in Turkey. But it's never been an easy relationship. It's always been quite difficult. There's an important difference, of course, which is that in Turkey, the United States is a subject of public opinion, public approval. You can talk to anybody in Turkey and they have a view about the United States, whether it's an official or someone you're dealing with in a day-to-day basis. It doesn't matter. Everybody knows about the US, everybody thinks they do anyway, and everybody has a view. In the US, this is simply not the case, obviously. But I mean this in an even more esoteric fashion, even for the foreign policy community. It's a sort of subset of the foreign policy community that has focused on this in any intensive way. And that's also true on Capitol Hill, where there are, in fact, some strong views about Turkey historically, and that matters today. I mean, if you like, I can say a word about some of these similarities, Özgür. I mean, you know, you can make a short list. I mean, we're both very sovereignty conscious. We're both very nationalistic. We like to say patriotic in the United States. I'm actually sitting in Brussels, but you know, in the United States, people use the term patriotism, but basically it's the same. And this has its sort of banal, everyday manifestations, but it also affects policy. The sovereignty consciousness, the sense of exceptionalism, you know, that we can sort of go our own way more comfortably than others can simply because of who we are. The sort of
I guess there is also
our geography,
destiny.
right?
Manifest destiny on both sides.
Manifest destiny, you have other vocabulary, you know, the continental scale of the place, if you want to think in geopolitical terms. Turkey is a big place with a lot of different natural kind of engagements, but also exposures, whether it's the Black Sea or the Middle East or the Aegean or whatever it might be. The United States case, I can come back to this, I mean, we're a bioceanic global power. And so, you know, there are a lot of similarities. We could say more about it, but just suffice it to say, it's historically a very difficult relationship to manage, and also certainly compared to what we've been talking about with Europe, a very one-dimensional one. And this is part of the problem. I mean, Europe and Turkey cannot get away from each other. They need to have a policy towards one another, whether it's values-based or transactional. For the United States, it can be all, and for Turkey, it can be all about military and security cooperation, and that has been 90% of it, I guess, for decades. And that's a very high pressure environment and very hard to manage. And you see that today.
Ian, before I turn to you, actually, there is Cameron. Please, if you want to ask a question, I see you have raised a hand. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. If you could type your question, that would be great. And that would be very helpful to me because it would be the first question that might maybe inspire others to ask other questions. So Ian, could you also talk a little bit about the current state of the relationship, but also before maybe you do that, about this, you know, argument that there was a golden age in US-Turkey relationship, that we always keep comparing the current state of the relationship. When was this golden age? Was there ever such a thing?
Well, I mean, you know, I like to think that it was probably during the Clinton administration when I was dealing with some of these issues. And I have to tell you, it did not seem like a golden age at the time. It seemed like a really difficult time. In fact, Turkey there were embargoes on weapons shipments, attack helicopters, frigates. There were big differences over the Aegean. There were big differences over the PKK for much of the time. I mean, this was a very difficult thing to manage, but in terms of certainly public opinion and towards the end, especially, there was a sense of kind of a greater warmth. And the United States, of course, played a big role in opening the door to what looked like a kind of strategic trajectory with the European Union. The customs union was a package deal, which was in some sense brokered by the United States. And, you know, that was maybe a high point, even though it was very, very difficult to manage. But, you know, it certainly was never easy. And yeah.
And what about today? What's the state of the relationship today, and what are the states?
It's honestly, I mean, to use a non-specialist word, it's dreadful. It's really in bad shape. I mean, let me talk about others can talk about the Turkish side of this. Let me talk about the American side of it. I would say it's nothing short of we've witnessed nothing short of a collapse in the strategic constituency for the relationship. That's that's to say something. It's very hard to find someone in Washington, especially these days, who will stick up for Turkey. And the body of sort of critics has simply grown over the years. And there are many, the issues are well known. But it's all sort of comes together around this S-400 purchase issue from Russia and the set of sanctions that have flowed from this. There are many things, different constituencies that were focused on different things, whether it was the human rights and media freedom. Those people are alienated. The people who were looking to the military cooperation side have been similarly alienated by the S-400 deal. It kind of goes back to that bigger question that you asked earlier, Özgür, about, is it about values or is it about transactional relations? It could be about, pardon me, it could be about either, but my view would be pick one. At the moment, in the relationship between Turkey and the United States, we have, frankly, neither. We're not on the same page when it comes to values, and we're not on the same page when it comes to many, many policy issues. So it's a highly dysfunctional moment. I think there are some pieces of it that are maybe brighter than others, but at the moment it's a very dysfunctional scene.
Although there seems to be some convergence on values lately, but I hope
that's an unfortunate, that's maybe not in the way that we would have wanted, perhaps. I mean, and that's a fair question because, the United States, needs to have a certain standing to make the kind of case we often like to make around human rights, democracy, media freedom, all sorts of things, treatment of migrants. And my own view is that that's been badly tarnished in recent years, and the events of the last weeks have really made it a much more difficult thing. I happen to think, actually, it's not our subject today, but I happen to think that, in fact, American democracy is actually very resilient, and American rule of law is very resilient if you look at some of these Supreme Court decisions in recent days. So maybe we'll regain a bit of that standing, but we are vulnerable to that loss of standing as well. And that is something to consider in the relationship because it affects public opinion, not least in Turkey.
Speaking of domestic angle in the United States, so you have your elections upcoming in November. Does the outcome of this election matter for U.S.-Turkey relations, and in what respect?
Well, this is a tremendous question. I mean, and it also, to some extent, is predicated on what we think is going to happen, which is another topic. But let us assume for the moment that former Vice President Biden wins. What will you have from a Turkish perspective? You will suddenly have a return to a much more predictable U.S. foreign policy, a very well-known set of people, many of whom have a lot of experience with Turkey in the region. You will have a more predictable set of relations with key alliances, including NATO, and this is meaningful, and including our relationship with the European Union as such, which all of that is meaningful for Turkey. Does this add up to a better, more stable, more positive relationship? Quite possibly not. Because if you were to identify a set of individuals in the United States who've been especially focused on the deterioration of various aspects of what we're talking about, whether it's the internal scene in Turkey or foreign policy cooperation, the people who would come in and be running U.S. foreign policy under Biden would be very focused on those things. So you will have a critical constituency looking very critically at Turkey on Capitol Hill, and you'll have a set of people coming in to manage U.S. foreign policy who will care about media freedom and rule of law and all of these things, which are problematic. And they're also going to be very focused and very tough, probably, much tougher maybe even than this administration on Russia, and certainly on China. All areas that touch on Turkish interests. So it's hard to see where you get improvement out of that, except in that narrower sense of alliance relations and sort of thinking about European security and engagement in the world generally. And of course, for those who are concerned about the trade side of this, you probably would see less of what we've seen in recent years, which is, trade sanctions on allies. So a mixed picture, but no automatic improvement in relations with Turkey, in my view.
Thank you. And Ilke, I realized that you were typing the same question while I was asking Ian. So, sorry for maybe stealing your question. But I may paraphrase that question later so that Ian can further respond. Now we're returning to Valeria on the Mediterranean. I used to say Eastern Mediterranean, but now it's the issue is shifting west a little bit with Libya, and there are so many angles to cover. So Valeria, your job will really be difficult. But my first question to you will be, so energy resources in the Eastern Mediterranean you have written in your section, has led to convergence among a certain group of Mediterranean countries and actually countries beyond the Mediterranean, but has caused divergence with Turkey. Whereas lately, there is a trend of decreasing oil prices, not only because of the pandemic, there are other reasons as well. And the game plans of all actors need to be revised, including Turkey. We see energy companies ending their operations in the Eastern Mediterranean as well. So how do you think that or do you think that these new market dynamics may actually transform the situation between Turkey and the rest in the Eastern Mediterranean? Is there a window of opportunity?
First of all, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for this opportunity. So the East Mediterranean energy picture today is quite bleak. The pandemic has changed greatly the prospects for gas exploitation and commercialization in Eastern Mediterranean. The gas market today is characterized by an excess of demand over an excess of supply, over a weak demand. So the effect of the weak demand and the economic crisis everywhere in the world have an impact on market, of course. And as you said, energy companies such as the Italian Eni and the French Total have put on hold for 1 year their scheduled gas drilling operations in Eastern Mediterranean. In this context, the ambitious East Med gas pipeline seems to be no longer on the table. Ambitious in terms of costs and in terms of technical feasibility. Today, no one is keen to invest in this project. So a project that is estimated to cost around 6 billion euro, and exporting gas through pipeline from the Eastern Mediterranean to European markets, that is no longer advantageous, at least in today's situation. So companies are quite cautious, and of course this is questioning the project of some regional players such as Egypt, Israel, Cyprus, Greece, that last January engaged once again in this important project. So the picture has changed, and some analysts say that keep the gas local would be the strategy in the post-pandemic world. What does it mean? That the market is local, and in this picture, Turkey has an important market for gas, and we know that Turkey imports the majority of gas from Russia, and diversification of energy supply would be it's important. It's an important aspect for Turkey. In this context, also Turkey seems to take advantage of the situation. And I think that maybe some channels for dialogue, for negotiation could open in this situation.
Yes. So there is an opportunity, but we cannot be sure that opportunity will be taken advantage of.
There is an opportunity, but of course, every country, and Turkey first, have to be more flexible and more open to negotiate and to dialogue. We know that in the last few years, Turkey has been more and more isolated in the regional context. And to break this isolation, Turkey has not hesitated to flex muscles to break also the front of other countries. So now maybe the situation has been changing, and it's time to open a dialogue.
Thank you, Valeria. Let's move west a little bit to Libya. So during the last couple of weeks, the GNA, through Turkey's help, has been able to roll back the successes of the LNA, the gains of the LNA, and actually drawn the LNA out of Western Libya. And news are coming that Turkey is now preparing to establish permanent presence in Western Libya with at least 2 military bases and also agreements to train the Libyan officer class. I mean, of course, in addition to economic agreements that would be made. So how does this change the balances in the Mediterranean?
This is, I think, an important game changer should the recent development prove durable. So if the stable and presence of Turkey in North Africa will be a game changer, will extend Turkey's influence in that part of the Mediterranean, contrasting the ambition to extend influence of other regional players. But of course, for other players, the presence of Turkey in North Africa could represent a threat, or in some cases could also, in these cases, open a channel for diplomatic negotiation to arrange a political solution of the Libyan crisis.
Thank you, Valeria. The last question to you, and this will be the last question to all of you actually, will be, I must confess, a little bit difficult because you will need to make assumptions and then speculations. But there are two opposing trends now regarding Turkey in the Mediterranean. On the one hand, Turkey is actually on the verge of clashing with multiple NATO allies and EU member states, with Greece, with the Republic of Cyprus lately, with France, and Turkey is coming head to head with almost every ally it has regarding what one of the participants in her or his question has characterized as gunboat diplomacy. So this is one aspect of what's going on with Turkey and the Mediterranean. On the other hand, Turkey is now one of those countries that are successfully contributing to, let's say, limiting Russia's increasing its influence in the Mediterranean, in Idlib, in Syria, in Libya, and Turkey is actually the only NATO ally that has recently directly confronted Russia, and here I'm meaning the battle in Idlib. So in the long run, I mean, these are two opposing trends. On the one hand, Turkey is on a collusion course with NATO allies and EU member states. On the other hand, Turkey seems to be fulfilling an important role that's actually part of NATO's strategy. So where does this take us in the long run?
It's a very difficult and very complicated questions. So, and it's not easy at the moment make any speculation about the long run. If we look today, the situation, we see that tensions prevail between Turkey and the other NATO allies because of Russia, because of the fact that Turkey acquired the S-400 missile defense system, although then because of the pandemic and because of other reasons, Turkey postponed its application. There are tensions with France recently that erupted in the Eastern Mediterranean. So I think that the tensions today seem to prevail, but of course Turkey remain an important ally, and maybe tensions are also the results of the strategic autonomy that Turkey has carried out in recent years. So the result of the autonomous foreign policy in the Eastern Mediterranean and elsewhere. And that this part of also the diversification of Turkish foreign policy in the last years. So I have no answer to your question for this. We will see in the medium short terms. Of course, at this very moment, I think that dialogue, channels of dialogue, and sit on the same table to discuss common issue would be the best thing to do.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Now, I will give 2 minutes to each speaker to answer one question. What does it take to keep the flame alive in Turkey-West relations, but also, I mean, to make any additional remarks that you may want before we turn to the question and answers. So I'll start in the same order with Galip. So Galip, what does it take to keep the flame alive? And please do respond to the remarks by other speakers also, if you would like.
Sure. Well, I think what does it take? I mean, right now, the important thing is basically not to break the glass. I mean, at this stage, I don't think the Turkish-Western relation will improve in any way. Both the domestic constraints in Turkey will not allow for this, and then the situation in the West will not allow it. And I think the major actors are not interested in this. So that's the most important thing. But let's not break it. And for this, I think let's not reduce the issue to unidimensionality in Turkish-Western relation, because like, as Ian said, 90% of the Turkish-US relation is effectively, this is a security partnership. I think the important part is to give a societal leg to this relationship, to give an economic dimension to it. Is it possible? That's a major question. But particularly when it comes to Europe, right now, the center of crisis between Turkey and Europe is moving from Berlin to Paris. When it comes to, in the previous Turkish-European crisis, the weight of the domestic politics and the diaspora was palpable. And now the logic of geopolitics is obvious between Turkey and France. And here is like, what we see in Libya and what we see in Eastern Mediterranean. The trouble, I think, like particularly in Libya, the France is in a quite trouble as well too, because like at least theoretically, or I mean, at least officially, it is on different side with many of other European countries. I mean, to carry a bit like, to make a caricature, I mean, a bit, I mean, effectively, we're talking about like, a proxy war to some extent, a proxy war between the French and Italians to some extent in Libya. So here the question that would be, well, the difference, let's not turn the difference between the France and Turkey over the Libya into a major European crisis, because in the end, the Europe has to settle the question of Libya among themselves and come up with a European policy. And I think like most of the Europeans basically support the UN recognized government. And I think like they're one of the major questions that France at this stage will be, is it going to like, openly and officially side with Haftar and then the Haftar side, because right now the France is kind of like, it's supporting, but like not recognizing that much officially. So I think let's not let Libya to be one of the basically relationship destroying mechanism between Turkey and Europe. If anything, actually, there is Europe has to make choices. Is it better for the Russia to gain more leverage in Libya, or is it like better to engage in a much closer coordination and dialogue with Turkey? Because at this stage, this is like more or less the options. But I think the most important part at this stage is to give societal leg to Turkish Western relationship, and the relationship should not be like reduced to current leadership, be it the Trump, be it Erdogan, etc. And for this, let's not just reduce the whole thing to one or two files. But for this to happen, I think it's very important that Turkey is not activating the S-400. So the S-400, Turkey should, hopefully will not reactivate it at all. But at least at this stage, hopefully it should not activate it indefinitely, because if it's activated, it seems to be one of the major game changers. So now let's keep the status quo for sometimes until we have a better climate.
Galip, you have provoked me, so Kadri, I will skip you for the time being and turn to Ian directly. So Ian, in case Turkey activates the S-400s, at some point, do you see a scenario in which it could end well?
Sorry, the last point, you mean, do I see a scenario in which
it doesn't end with a tragedy?
Well, look, I mean, one can manage all sorts of things, but there's no question that if Turkey activates this system, and there's in fact a debate about whether it hasn't in part been activated already, partly, but anyway, it's simply going to add fuel to the fire, and whoever is president in the United States next is going to be focused on this. Certainly on Capitol Hill, there's going to be a lot of attention to this, and it's a kind of, international relations is filled with examples of self-harm these days, but this is certainly one of them. And one of the ways to mitigate that, I think, would be to keep these things in their crates. It's an expensive thing to do, obviously, but then, what is that a price that's worth paying to avoid a kind of long-term strategic estrangement with the United States? I think that's quite important to do. You want me to come in on the question of what?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, well, look, it's looked at from an American point of view. I think what is extremely important is that the NATO dimension remains strong, because that's the part that more or less works. Yes, there are tensions, but this is a place where Turkey has a seat at the table. Turkey may not be the most popular member of the alliance at the moment, but there's a bit of a competition over that, for that role. Some of the complaints about Turkey inside NATO are not dissimilar to the complaints about the United States. They have to do with a kind of lack of consultation on areas, policy decisions that affect allies as a whole, whether it's S-400s or interventions in Syria or other things. There's a sense a little bit that the United States and Turkey at the moment are somewhat, and we're not the only examples in NATO, but maybe the most obvious ones are kind of loose cannons in a sense. In any case, the NATO part of the relationship is easier to manage, works better than the bilateral part. And if there are pieces of the US-Turkish defense and security relationship that could be shifted into the NATO frame, I think that would be worth doing. The other piece is about risk reduction. And this is mainly about the Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean. There is simply a growing risk of things going wrong, whether it's with Greece above all, or whether it's with Cyprus, or whether it's with France. And that is extremely unhealthy, because it's one thing to manage risk when the rest of the relationship is relatively stable. When the rest of the relationship with Europe and the United States is not stable, this kind of brinkmanship can easily get out of control. And we may not have a Richard Holbrooke anymore as we had in 1996 to come in and sort of bring people together. We're in a different world now with the United States and Europe very, very distracted. So risk reduction is important. Finally, very different front on civil society. I think above all for Europe, but it's true for the United States as well. This is a part of the relationship that has been relatively underdeveloped historically, certainly for the United States. And we will find ways probably to do more, whether it's at the city level or with NGOs or whatever it might be. That's, I think, another very useful thing to keep in mind.
Thank you very much, Ian. Kadri, back to you. What do you think it takes to keep the flame alive?
Well, I would like to use the term, in economics, in the introductory economics, we are using the concept of trade-off or opportunity cost. And in French, we have even maybe much clearer sense in that manque à gagner or the coup d'opportunité. Means we have the limited, in economics, limited sources. So if we invest in something, we are of course, we forego producing another product. And in the politicals, actually, we can even apply to the political issue, I believe. And here, both sides are having and subject to the self-destruction opportunity cost with respect to their relationship. So instead of investing in dialogue, enjoying the benefits of dialogue, the economic and political benefits of this dialogue in every sense of the terms, as I said, both sides are just subject to the self-destruction. So I think we should focus on that. What is the opportunity cost of this situation for the both sides?
Thank you, Kadri. Valeria, what does it take to keep the flame burning?
I think that, as is already said, both sides have to stress on on historical links, economic links, and civil society links. So, although the diversification of Turkey's foreign policy over the last years, relations ties with Europe and with the United States remain really crucial and important, and both sides have to be aware of this. The economic dimension, I think it's really important and could be the good restarting point to reassess the relations. If we look at Turkish trade with Europe, it is the most important part of Turkey's global trade. If we look at investment, if we look at the presence also of European companies in Turkey and the interest of these companies. And of course, there are important links between civil society. For example, I can talk about Italy. We have thousands and thousands of Turkish students in Italy, above all in northern Italy, that represent a good link, I think, between Italy and, as far as Italy is concerned, and Turkey.
Thank you very much, Valeria. And let me thank all of our speakers. Ceylan will moderate the question and answer session. So Ceylan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Özgür. Happy to join you with reading the questions. And we currently have 3 questions. I will start with the first one. It's from Konstantinos Adamides. And it's open for all of our speakers, but I think it's proper for Ian or Valeria to pick it up. So it proceeds as, do you believe there is a red line for the West, be it the EU or the US, on how much of this Turkish gunboat diplomacy they are willing to accept?
Well, keen to hear what Valeria thinks as well, but a red line. Not formally, but there are clearly contingencies one can imagine that would be particularly corrosive. I mean, the one I think of above all is some sort of a unintentional clash between Turkey and Greece. This touches on something that's politically really explosive on Capitol Hill, and because the relationship with Greece has gotten closer in recent years for Washington, you know, I can bet where the sympathies are going to be. Of course, it depends on the nature of the case, but I think that would be extremely dangerous. I mean, the last time we had something very serious like that, it was managed. Times before that, we had, you know, sanctions that lasted for decades over Cyprus. So I think we need to be very, very careful about that one. In a more technical sense, of course, making the S-400 system operational would probably foreclose a lot of opportunities that are still there to work together on the defense and security side. And to an extent, that's an informal red line, I would say, for the United States.
Do you have anything to add, Valeria?
I agree with Ian about the red lines about the S-400 defense system and about relations between Turkey and Greece. I think that the red line should be also the refugee and migrant issue, which is an important issue at stake between Turkey and the EU. And it seems that over the last year, the EU has been perceived to be too weak vis-a-vis Turkey in this situation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Did I see the fingers from you, Kadri?
Yes, please. Well, I would like to just add some comments on what can be the red line and what would be the reaction from US and or the EU. On the US side, I think we are sometimes receiving, well, from State Department, quite strong, let's say, support for all this, you know, gas energy cooperation, really strong support for the gas forum that has been created. But from the administration, I don't have impression that there is a really this strong support is coming up. So it will depend so much how the US politics will evolve, and obviously the election will affect enormously. In this case, if the Democrats are coming for Turkey, maybe they can maybe draw much more red lines in the US case. I don't know if Ian would agree with me. But in the European case, I don't believe that the European Union will have a common red line for this issue. And just why I'm saying this, just look at what was the European reaction. It was, I'm not saying that it should be stronger, but I'm saying to make me understand how much it was quite timid, actually, European reaction until now. And it was conducted by some specific countries, especially, I think, of course, Greek and Greece and Greek administration in Cyprus are concerned directly, of course, reaction from them, but more specifically from France and in some extent from Italy. I mean, France is conducting this policy, let's say, and trying to draw the red line. Who will have willingness to draw some red line? And we saw that in, for example, this not clash, but this accident that happened with between French and Turkish Navy, of course, it's related to the Libyan case, but not only. I think it's a really much broader in the Eastern Mediterranean. This French-Turkish clash that is coming to the question. Just don't forget that France is giving and even planning to construct some naval base in South Cyprus.
Yeah, if I may just a two-finger on this. I mean, thank you for mentioning the personality element of this. I didn't mention that earlier, but you know, presumably one of the differences you would have in the Biden administration is that you wouldn't have this apparently sort of close sympathetic relationship between Trump and President Erdogan. I mean, in John Bolton's unpublished yet book, apparently one of the key cases he talks about is the Halkbank case, in which, you know, Trump apparently was quite willing to offer things to President Erdogan that the U.S. foreign policy system would have reeled from. And so, yeah, there is exactly, as you say, Kadri, they're mixed signals, but they come from the very eccentric role of the president and the presidents, if I can say in this case, which their respective foreign policy systems don't necessarily agree with. So, you know, it's a factor that we need to reckon with.
Thank you for your answers and comments. The next one is from Ambassador Mark Pierini, and it's addressed to Galip. Do you believe that being less dependent on the West can be achieved through harsh language, paramilitary operations on the Greek border, unilateral redefinition of maritime borders, etc.? For the moment, what I witness is a series of unilateral moves, all very logical in terms of domestic politics, that end up creating a pile of mostly unrelated dead ends. Adding to this is the absence of trust in Turkey's president among EU leaders. Don't we have the first an issue of style and animosity, and second an issue of substance?
Well, thank you very much. Well, I'm not sure whether I will agree with the assumption, some of the assumption of this question. One of them, unilateral moves. Most of right now, major powers is actually undertaking quite unilateral moves when it comes to, like, for what they deem as their primary goals or primary strategies, particularly in what they regard as a core interest. So in this regard, I think unilateral moves are more and more become the new normals in international affairs. Secondly, I will dispute the EU, because I think that right now when Turkey look at the Europe, it doesn't look at the Brussels. It looks at the major capitals when it shapes its foreign policy. So, I mean, the EU used to be the capital that Turkey look at it, let's say, you know, when it was actually much more interested in this accession process. Now, the more the relation is becoming transactional, and the more the relation are being shaped by the logic of geopolitics, economy, rather than, like, you know, the EU playing the transformative role in Turkey's domestic politics, the more Turkey look at the different capitals in Europe, particularly like Berlin, but, you know, the other capitals as well too, and the more the Europe is engaging Turkey in bilateral terms. I mean, look at the last important deal between Turkey and Europe is the refugee deal, and this was not like an EU deal. I mean, yes, it was, you know, framed as an EU, but the way that it was negotiated, the partner, this was like mostly bilateral deals with certain European countries, particularly with Germany, Netherlands, etc. But again, like, you know, this was not like, you know, a Turkey EU thing. So what I see in this regard, I mean, as I said, like, when you speak to the policymakers in Ankara, I don't think that any of them will say, like, you know, they're giving up on the West. But when I say that they're reducing their dependency on the West, this is more has to do what Turkey is doing with the other actors, the nature of Turkey's engagement with other actors. And this is already being the case. We saw this in Syria. I mean, through the Astana and the Sochi process, basically Turkey got, I mean, prior to the Astana and Sochi process, Turkey was railing on the other side of the borders. It was like, you know, becoming less and less out of the, I mean, feeling less and less powerful on the Syrian crisis. Through engagement with Russia, Turkey got on the border and very much, like, you know, shaped the outcome of the crisis in certain part of the Syria quite dramatically in its own image. Whether this was the right, whether this is a good one for Turkey's security in the long term or not, is another question. But in the end, Turkey believes the fact that it could engage Russia is what it got Turkey into the picture in Syria. So I think in the end, this is what you will see continue. Turkey will be like in Libya, for instance. Turkey, I think, will be pursuing several deals at the same time. One of them will be obviously with Russia. Another one, like, you know, at the same time, try to like reach out to the US as well too. And then the like-minded European states. Again, there, when I said, like, you know, I'm talking about like-minded European states. I'm not talking about the EU, because Turkey will not engage EU because there is no EU policy on Libya. And I think this is like, you know, what it will continue. And the more that the Europe is sending the message that it is quite willing to engage in bilateral deal, very much shaped with bilateral and transactional deals, very much shaped by the logic of, you know, core national interest, rather than like, you know, all these like transformative aspect of the EU process. I don't anticipate, you know, there will be animosity between Turkey and certain European leaders. The trust will not be there. It's not there. As I said, the harsh language is not, you know, is not doing any favor, let's say, like, you know, any good to Turkey. But will this produce actually big costs that Turkey has to face at this stage? I'm not sure. Like, I don't see this is coming from Europe, because as I've heard thus far, the Europe, I mean, when you look at the track record of all the crises between Turkey and Europe, you don't see a very concrete outcome or cause that Turkey had to face. I mean, one of them, you might say, like, actually, Turkey is not, the fact that Turkey is not getting a constant union modernization in itself is a cause. Yes. Or like, you know, the visa-free travel is a cause. Yes. But this is not how it's seen, I think, like, you know, among the Turkish policymakers.
Thank you very much, Galip.
The last point, like, when you compare, the more that Turkey is gaining influence in Europe's neighborhood, southern neighborhood, the more the balance of leverage Turkey feels that it's changing in its favor.
Thank you. And actually, there's a follow-up question from Barçın Yinanç, and it will be great if you can pick this up as well, Galip. Sure. And it follows as, are all Turkish foreign policy moves related solely to domestic politics? Is there no logic, no rationale on its moves in East Med? Some analysts seem to attribute all to domestic politics. Anyone able to explain the legitimacy behind France's policy of challenging UN-supported government in Libya?
I think, I mean, obviously there's very clear logic. I mean, particularly to Turkey's Eastern Mediterranean policy, I think any Turkish government would have more or less pursued a similar policy in Eastern Mediterranean than, you know, the way that Turkey does currently. On Cyprus, I don't think that there will be difference between the current government or a government like most of the governments that came before it. So in this regard, I think the East Med, the Cyprus, will be one of the less contentious policy between different political parties in the country. So in this regard, there is a clear logic to it, I think, from the Turkish perspective. This is not like, you know, I wouldn't see this like more through the lenses of domestic politics. So like, for instance, like some of the policy, let's say, on Egypt, the policy on the Kurds would be different depending on who is in power. But I think when it comes to Eastern Mediterranean or Cyprus, I think more or less this is like there is that continuity there, and then the good thing that Turkey feels, particularly in Libya, because Turkey feels like in Libya, politically and legally, it is on the sound ground because it's supporting the UN recognized government, whereas like, you know, it feels that it's actually the France that is in trouble because like effectively it's supporting what is being depicted as the warlord in the form of the Haftar. So in this regard, I don't see there will be any contention among major political parties in Turkey when it comes to Turkey's policy on Eastern Mediterranean. So this is like more of a state policy or a government policy that will gain the support of quite large section of political parties.
Thank you, Galip. I think Özgür has two fingers. Yeah,
yes, actually what Galip has just said can, I think, be generalized. And in doing so, I will borrow from Galip. I will quote Galip himself. The post-Erdogan period in Turkey will not necessarily be anti-Erdogan when it comes to foreign policy. So I have heard this from Galip, and a lot of people assume it will be. But whenever there is a post-Erdogan period, there will be some continuity as well as change in terms of foreign policy. I don't know if Galip would like to add anything to this?
No, absolutely, I agree with you. I mean, there will be some changes. For instance, as I said, like the relation on Egypt, highly likely, if there's a different government, that will change. The relation maybe on Assad himself, when it comes to recognizing or not recognizing or engaging the Assad himself, might change. The relation on, on Israel might be a bit, different. But on Eastern Mediterranean, I don't think that it will change. The crisis in Turkish-Western relationship, well, the language will change. This harsh language will not be there, but the essence of the crisis in Turkish-Western relationship will be different. I don't think that a new government will go that much in relation with Russia, but a new government will not, will still seek like some balance to Turkey's traditional Western relations as well too. So in this regard, yes, there will be areas of change. Obviously, the change of the actors means significantly, but on overall, particularly when it comes to crisis between Turkey and the West and the policy towards the Eastern Mediterranean, post-Erdogan will not be anti-Erdogan. It will be more or less the continuation of today.
Thank you. The next question is from Lincoln McCurdy. And if you can pick this up as well, Galip, that would be great. What's Turkey's view on recent US efforts to unite the Kurds in Syria? Could this potentially lay the foundation for Turkey getting comfortable with Kurdish autonomy in northeastern Syria?
Well, I mean, there is a discursive position of Turkey, but then I also look at what Turkey is doing. Discursively, Turkey very much criticized it, condemned it. But when I look at it, Turkey didn't put pressure on KRG, Kurdistan Regional Government, because the KRG is one of the actors that is facilitating along the US this process. And also the Kurdish Nation Council, which have presence in Turkey as well too. Turkey didn't put also pressure on KNC. So in a sense, like I think like Turkey still is watching without like really resorting to punitive measures against the actors that are facilitating this process, particularly the KRG and the KNC. So Turkey can perfectly, resort to punitive measures. Let's say like, Turkey perfectly can kick the KNC out of Turkey, or like, put pressure on the Syrian opposition to cut the ties with the KNC, or like to put the pressure on Iraqi Kurds. So we are not seeing any of them happening at this stage. I think Turkey is a bit adopting wait and see approach, because to some extent Turkey sees many challenges are remaining ahead of these unity talks. One of them, because like one of the major trouble will the PYD, YPG, or SDF be willing to accept the KNC to have presence in the administrative and security structure in northeastern Syria? That's questionable. Particularly, you have like thousands of Syrian Rosh Peshmerga that is in Iraqi Kurdistan, and the KNC wants this to be incorporated into the security structure in northeastern Syria. So I think Turkey is a bit looking at where it is heading from here. But at this stage, what I see, I don't think that we will be seeing normalization between Turkey and the Syrian Kurds anytime soon, because the domestic political alliance structure that is exists in Turkey will not allow this. The question is, will Turkey, in a sense, like be willing to treat this as a frozen crisis? And that can be, that I see can be one of the possibility. And in exchange, I think the US can facilitate more Turkey's strike, more Turkey's basically, war on the PKK in Iraqi Kurdistan, and this is also already happening. So in a sense, like a bit of, not doing anything actively against the Syrian Kurds in northeastern Syria, but at the same time undertaking several sustained air campaign and ground campaign against the PKK in Iraqi Kurdistan. I see this being quite likely.
Thank you, Galip. The next question is from Erdem İlter, and Ian, if you can pick this up, that would be great. When you look at the grand picture, you see regional powers in Eurasia, mainly India, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Russia are acting like the former European colonial powers in terms of expanding their area of influence politically, economically, and more significantly militarily. Is this a new trend in the non-Western world?
Well, I would agree with it at a kind of symptomatic level. I mean, you can certainly see behavior that looks a bit along the lines that have been suggested. I mean, it looks like kind of old-style geopolitical competition in a regional frame. You know, and it has some very dramatic consequences if you look at what's happening between China and India at the moment. I mean, there is, you know, as we sort of think through what this COVID crisis, we haven't spoken too much about that, but the economic crisis that goes along with it and other things, you know, a lot can go on that simply we're not paying attention to. There is a lot of brinkmanship that can go on that might in the past have been suppressed, subdued, controlled by larger powers that will simply go either unnoticed or if not unnoticed, at least without a lot of response. And I think that increases the risks for everyone, frankly. The question is whether any of those actors that have been named, including Turkey, really want to live in a world where they don't have strong alliance relationships to deal with what is likely to be a kind of extended chaos in various regions. And I think some of the behavior the question alludes to is not just a matter of kind of a rediscovery of assertiveness, of kind of new geopolitics. It's not just that. It's the fact that things are going wrong in a very serious way in many different settings that are affecting security, both domestic and international. And you know, if the United States, if Europe are not going to be suppressing these things, who is? Well, you know, I think that to go back to the question that Barcin had asked earlier, you know, what's behind Turkish foreign policy? I mean, this could be one of the things. I mean, Turkey, you can argue with the premise perhaps, but Turkey sees very direct security consequences coming to itself from some of these developments in its neighborhood, and has been emboldened to intervene in a way, and I would say actually operationally very successful. That's surprised a lot of people. And so that's another piece to this. Not only will there be regional actors in Eurasia who are doing more and being more assertive, but some of them have real capacity to act and are demonstrating a real ability to operate in a very effective way. And that will undoubtedly have consequences, especially if you think many years ahead. The United States is simply going to be focused on other things. Europe may or may not get its foreign policy act together. It leaves a lot of scope for regional actors to assume a more active posture.
Thank you, Ian. We have two questions from Ambassador Stefano Manservisi, and I will read them one by one. And Kadri, Valeria, that it would be great if you can pick the first one up. To what extent EU plans to build back better, including on reshaping strategic supply chains, if it will be really the case, would give a chance to relaunch the EU-Turkey relations? Valeria, can you please pick?
Sorry, may I ask you to repeat the question because there was a noise in my house? Sorry.
Of course, I will read again. To what extent EU plans, am I on mute? No, I'm on mute.
No, okay.
To what extent EU plans to build back better, including on reshaping strategic supply chains, if it will be really the case, would give a chance to relaunch EU-Turkey relations?
It's a good question, and maybe Kadri, who is an economist better than me, could answer better than me this question. So I leave to him.
Okay, Kadri, can you please speak?
Well, we the economists are generally really bad in economics, but I will try to answer the question. Yeah, surely, I mean, the pandemic revealed the fragility of the modern supply chains, obviously, and and there is all this discussion, not only in the European level, globally. I mean, to create, let's say, to build stronger, smarter supply chains and for the future. And there is also in this discussion around reindustrialization, etc., in Europe especially, which is actually also quite contradictional when we are, because just remember that one of the main pillars of the EU, let's say the Commission's policies is the Green Deal, right? So all this discussion about reindustrialization, it can be maybe contradictional with this discourse, but at the same time, it's quite logical. I mean, it's quite important, this discussion, and Turkey can potentially find a space in this discussion. But we shouldn't forget that actually for this also we are also discussing this because we need also trust when we are trading with the country. So given the situation in EU-Turkey relations, as I said, there is a potential, but to create this is another question. I mean, this economic sense is pushing. I'm coming to the same concept. I mean, the opportunity cost of the EU-Turkey relations, right? So if we improve the trust between two parts and all these political issues are resolved, obviously there is a base, and there is all this discussion around the customs union modernization. So it can be a really perfect time. But don't forget that even in the European level, there was a huge discussion. And at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a chaotic situation. So because the countries, even the European countries didn't want to share each other, the materials, the masks, etc. And Turkey did quite well, actually, because Turkey is a producer of the health material, the mask, etc. So it was one of the strongest in this case. So Turkey can be, of course, when Turkey is located and its economic structure is given strong comparative advantage actually on this matter to create. To be in this reconfiguration of the supply chains for the European Union. But of course, the political dialogue will be needed here again.
Thank you, Kadri. And the correction, the next question is not from Stefano Servisi, but it's from Stefano Stefanini. And it follows as, how does the Libya issue play in the Turkey-West relations? Turkey is now the only counterweight to Russian inroad in Libya, but a number of European countries are most resentful than grateful. And it's open for all of our panelists. Who would like to pick this up?
I can pick it up.
Please.
Sure. Well, I mean, first Europe a bit has to ask a very simple question. Why and how Turkey and Russia that became the crucial actor in Libya? Well, I think the answer to some extent is quite easy, because the Europe either played quite narrow policies, which was like conflicting with each other. I mean, the GNA for quite a long time tried to get support from the Europe, but its plea for support fell on deaf ears. And then the GNA turned to Turkey. So in a sense, if the Europe is unhappy with the GNA's turn to Turkey, and if Europe is unhappy with the Russia gaining that much leverage in Libya, the simple question is, then why didn't you pursue a sustainable policy that would have given a bit of influence to you? Why didn't you step in to support, to provide support to GNA when it actually asked from you at a time that it was quite desperate? And the Haftar launched this campaign to take over the Tripoli. So in a sense, it was the European impotence and the European actually terrible policies that facilitated other actors playing major roles in Europe's immediate neighborhood. The second question that will be a simple question: can Europe engage in a double containment policy at the same time, try to contain Turkey and Russia at the same time? I think the answer to this, no. The Europe cannot, at the same time try to contain Turkey and Russia. And then the third question, what Europe should be doing at this stage. I mean, being resentful doesn't seem to be a policy option. I mean, you might feel unhappy, but this is not a policy option. So what can Europe do at this stage? I think the options are quite open, either like, to develop a policy at the European level, because like the Europe's contradictory policies, like among the major European actors, is effectively reducing European possibility, European prospect to play any major role, or then decide like, which track is much more meaningful at this stage. I still think that Libya can be one of the contexts. Particularly, I see that this is being the case in Turkey's engagement with countries like Italy or Germany, where we can have like a much more meaningful, we can have a dialogue between major European powers and Turkey. I mean, I don't think that Europe can contain Turkey and Russia at the same time. So therefore, like a question to Europe, which is better for Europe, to have like, Russia actually gaining more influence in Europe's immediate neighborhood, which is not part of NATO, or to have like, basically Turkey through NATO, you can still put pressure on Turkey. So I feel like, Libya at this stage, a meaningful road would be a more engagement between Turkey and the West. And one of them should also have repercussion on the ground, basically to help the GNA to build governance capacity, to its governance capacity, to make it much more inclusive. Basically, the GNA operating as the government of the Libya, not just like one faction that is fighting in Libya. If the European countries are recognizing GNA as the legitimate UN recognized government, then I think the logical way should be like to act as such, basically to basically support the GNA's capacity to be the government of all Libya, to make it inclusive, to make it like to help it to have a security reform, to help it to have an administrative reform. So in a sense, like, is a failed Libya is good for Europe, or a function Libya is the good thing for it? I think like the Haftar would have been a terrible choice for European security as well too. Does Europe need another Sisi that is ruling in Europe's immediate backyard? I think this is like to some extent the trouble of France vis-a-vis Libya. Effectively, it's supporting, the person that it's supporting wants to establish another military dictatorship in Tripoli. Is this a good policy for the European security? I'm not sure.
Thank you, Galip. All of the questions are now addressed to, and thank you to all of our panelists for their responses. Back to you, Özgür.
Well, thank you, Ceylan, for the excellent moderation of the question and answer session. And let me thank all panelists and also all participants remaining with us. We will, of course, continue these discussions in the future, including during summer, but during the summer months, it can be less frequent than it used to be. So farewell until the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
Just for the weekend.
Bye-bye.